The air here was a whisper of sterile, metallic tang, a memory I couldn't place. My eyelids felt like leaden weights, but when I forced them open, the world resolved into a dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing. The rhythmic hiss and sigh from unseen rooms was a lullaby of dread. My own breath hitched, a shallow, ragged thing. I tried to move, but a strange lassitude held me, a heavy cloak woven from exhaustion and a fear I couldn't name. The floor tiles, a pale, unassuming gray, seemed to stretch into an infinite, muted tunnel. What had brought me to this hushed, forgotten place? The question was a ghost, hovering just beyond my grasp, like a forgotten name on the tip of a dry tongue. But that was later, or perhaps, it was a dream yet to fully manifest. Before the quiet breathing of machines, before the gray expanse of absence, there was the rumble of a tired engine on a gravel track, and the looming silhouette of Blackwood. The estate, Blackwood, had been a surprise, an unexpected inheritance from a distant, almost mythical relation I'd barely known existed. My life, until then, had been one of precise lines and verifiable truths. I, Reid, had found solace and purpose in the meticulous art of historical cartography, charting the vanished contours of forgotten landscapes, meticulously recreating the world as it once was. A city's growth, a river's forgotten bend, the shifting sands of a coastline, these were my narratives, told in ink and parchment, each detail a testament to rigorous research and an unwavering eye for accuracy. My hands, accustomed to the delicate dance of pen on aged vellum, now gripped the steering wheel, the leather worn smooth beneath my palms. Blackwood, however, defied all my established principles of order. It was less a house, more a monument to decay, nestled deep within a wilderness that seemed to actively resist human encroachment. The drive alone had been a journey back in time, the tarmac dissolving into pitted gravel, then finally, a rutted track barely wide enough for my vehicle. Ancient oaks, their branches gnarled and thick as a cartographer's gnomon, clawed at the bruised sky, their leaves a muted, weary green even in the height of summer. The air, heavy and damp, carried the scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old iron left out in the rain, or perhaps, something older, deeper, buried beneath the soil. The house itself was a hulking, asymmetrical presence, its gray stone facade streaked with lichen and moss, like a face weeping slow, green tears. A single raven, perched atop a weather-beaten chimney, watched my approach with an unnerving stillness, its obsidian eye seeming to hold ancient, unspoken knowledge. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of generations and the phantom scent of forgotten lives. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets stood like shrouded specters. My first task, a necessary one for a man of my temperament, was to establish some semblance of order amidst the chaos. It was in the study, a room lined with towering, dust-laden bookshelves, that I found it. Tucked away in a false bottom of an ancient cedar chest, beneath layers of brittle deeds and faded correspondence, lay a rolled parchment. Its very appearance set my professional instincts alight. Carefully, I unrolled it across the vast, scarred mahogany desk. It was a map, clearly, but unlike any I had ever encountered. The parchment itself was thick, almost leathery, with the deep ochre hue of extreme age. The ink, a rich, almost black pigment, had bled subtly into the fibers in places, giving the lines a soft, organic quality. It depicted Blackwood and its immediate surrounding lands, but with a level of detail that transcended mere property boundaries. Every gully, every rise, every ancient stand of trees was rendered with an almost obsessive precision. I traced a finger along the faint, intricate lines of a dry creek bed, noting the minute undulations of the terrain, the precise placement of ancient boulders. This was the Work of a master, a hand that understood the very bone structure of the land. Yet, it was incomplete. Large sections, particularly towards the northern boundary of the estate, simply ceased, the detailed topography abruptly giving way to blank, untouched parchment. It was as if the cartographer had stopped mid-stroke, or had been prevented from finishing. More unsettling were the symbols. Scattered across the mapped areas, particularly near an ancient, nameless grove marked with an unusually dense cluster of trees, were small, almost imperceptible glyphs. They were not standard cartographic symbols for elevation or vegetation. They were angular, arcane, reminiscent of forgotten runes, etched with a delicate ferocity that belied their size. One, in particular, a jagged spiral enclosing a single, unblinking eye, seemed to pulse with a silent malevolence. My cartographer's mind, trained to seek patterns and explain anomalies, immediately bristled. Why such detail, then such incompleteness? What did these symbols signify? This was no mere inheritance, it was an enigma, a challenge etched in faded ink, and I, Reid, felt an irresistible pull to decipher its silent language. The map wasn't just old, it felt ancient, burdened with a history that resonated with the very earth it depicted, a history I was now, unwittingly, bound to unearth. The rhythmic hiss and sigh from unseen rooms was a lullaby of disquiet. A cold, distant hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound both alien and intimately familiar, a thrumming deep within my bones. Where was I? How had I come to this place of hushed, mechanical sorrow? The question echoed, unanswered, in the vast, silent reaches of my mind. Then, with a gasp that tore at my throat, I was back. My eyes snapped open to the familiar, if unsettling, sight of my ancestral bedchamber. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak morning light that pierced the heavy, velvet curtains. I sat upright, the rough linen sheets cool against my back, the lingering taste of copper on my tongue. The estate, a sprawling testament to forgotten time, awaited. Its silence was not empty, but pregnant with the weight of generations, of secrets buried deep beneath its sprawling acres. The ancient map lay on the scarred oak desk, a beacon in the gloom. Its parchment, brittle with age, curled at the edges, the intricate inkwork a spiderweb of detail. My fingers traced the delicate lines, the familiar compulsion of a cartographer taking hold. This wasn't merely a document, it was a puzzle, an incomplete narrative of the land, hinting at features that defied modern record. I needed to walk its lines, to verify its truth, to fill in its unsettling blanks. Armed with the map, a compass, and a small, leather-bound notebook, I ventured out. The morning air was thick and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The house itself seemed to sigh as I closed the heavy oak door behind me, its leaded windows like vacant eyes watching my departure. The overgrown paths, choked with brambles and ivy, wound like forgotten veins through the estate. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of ancient oaks and gnarled elms, leaving much of the immediate surroundings in a perpetual, verdant twilight. My first objective was the southern boundary, where the map depicted a series of what appeared to be boundary stones, marked with an unfamiliar symbol. According to the modern deeds, this section should have been a simple, wooded perimeter. Yet, as I pushed through a curtain of thorny bushes, I found them. Not simple markers, but crude, gray monoliths, their surfaces slick with moss, their edges worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. They stood unevenly, not in a straight line, but arranged in a loose, irregular arc, almost forming a half-circle around a particularly dense thicket. Each bore the faint, deeply carved symbol from the map, a spiral, tight and inward coiling, like a vortex. They seemed to point not outward, defining a border, but inward, towards something hidden within the thicket. I consulted the map again, my brow furrowed. There was no corresponding structure or feature marked within that thicket, only a blank space, a lacuna in the otherwise meticulous drawing. Yet, the air within that cluster of trees felt different. A sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature made me shiver, though the sun was now higher, warming the rest of the forest floor. It was a cold that bit, not with the crispness of a winter morning, but with a damp, ancient chill, as if I had stepped into the shadow of a glacier. My breath plumed faintly in the sudden frigidity. Then came the sounds. A low, persistent thrumming, barely audible at first, seemed to emanate from beneath the earth itself. It was a rhythmic vibration, felt more than heard, resonating through the soles of my boots. It wasn't the hum of power lines, nor the rumble of distant traffic, it was organic, subterranean, like the slow, deep heartbeat of something vast and buried. It was too regular, too heavy, to be a small creature, yet too elusive to pinpoint. My cartographer's mind, usually so adept at ordering the chaos of the world into precise lines and symbols, struggled to process these anomalies. But the consistency, the sheer wrongness of it all, began to chip away at my scientific resolve. I stood amidst the ancient trees, the compass clutched in my trembling hand, its needle quivering erratically, unable to settle. The estate pressed in around me, no longer a mere inheritance, but a living, breathing enigma. The map, once a guide, now felt like a cryptic warning, its blank spaces less about missing information and more about deliberate concealment. The estate was not merely decaying, it was active, stirring with a presence that defied my understanding, its ancient secrets beginning to unfurl, demanding to be acknowledged. The rhythmic hiss and sigh from unseen rooms, a mechanical breath, a heartbeat I couldn't feel within my own chest. The fluorescent tubes above hummed with a low, sick drone, casting a pallid glow that made the beige walls seem jaundiced. A faint, sterile scent, a ghost of antiseptic, pricked at my nostrils, utterly alien to the damp earth and decaying wood of the estate. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle beneath my skin. Why was I alone? Then, the floor beneath me bucked. Not violently, but with a subtle, deep tremor that resonated through my bones. The humming of the lights faltered, then intensified, a shrill whine that scraped against my teeth. My vision blurred, the pristine hallway wavering at its edges, stretching and distorting like an image reflected in disturbed water. A wave of nausea rolled over me, and I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against my temples as if to hold my skull together. When I opened them again, the hallway was gone. The cold, polished linoleum had vanished, replaced by the familiar, rough weave of my own bedsheets. The air was thick with the scent of dust and ancient timber, and the only sound was the wind, a long, mournful sigh, rattling the loose panes of glass in the study window. I was back in the estate, the dream or hallucination of the hallway already fading into a nebulous, unsettling memory, leaving behind only a lingering sense of profound displacement. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. Had I been sleepwalking? The thought brought little comfort. I found myself perpetually glancing over my shoulder, a prickle of unease at the nape of my neck. A flicker at the threshold of the drawing room, too dense for the ambient light, gone before my gaze could fully register it. A deepening of the air itself, just beyond the frame of the kitchen door, then nothing but the familiar, peeling wallpaper. I rationalized it as fatigue, the strain of meticulous cartography under poor light, or perhaps the psychological toll of isolation. This place, with its creaking bones and echoing chambers, could easily play tricks on a man's mind. Not words, not truly. More like the rustle of dry leaves caught in a draft that wasn't there, or the brittle sigh of old paper, just at the threshold of hearing. They seemed to seep from the very plaster of the walls, rising and falling with an almost imperceptible rhythm, like the faint, distant murmur of a sleeping crowd. I told myself it was the wind, or the ancient timbers settling, but the sound was too intimate, too close, too much like a breath held just out of reach. Then came the subtle shifts. Objects, which I prided myself on arranging with almost obsessive precision, would be subtly rearranged. My compass, which I'd left precisely aligned with the northern edge of the desk, now pointed a fraction off, toward the darkest corner of the room where the shadow often danced. A single, heavy volume of local history, its spine cracked, lay open on the floor beside my armchair, though I distinctly recalled closing it the night before. These were not grand, theatrical gestures, but minute, almost imperceptible changes, designed to sow doubt, to make me question my own memory, my own sanity. I would realign the compass, close the book, and try to dismiss it as my own absent-mindedness, a side effect of deep concentration. But the seed of unease had been planted. The nights offered no reprieve. The dreams were not of monsters, but of pressure. Of being pressed into the soil, the weight of centuries settling on my chest, the faint, earthy tang of rot filling my lungs. The parchment, brittle and aged, lay spread across my desk. I smoothed its surface, my fingers tracing the familiar contours of the estate, the careful lines of the old surveyor. But as I traced a familiar contour, my fingers snagged. A new line, faint but undeniably present, bisected a previously unmarked patch of dense woodland, twisting with an organic irregularity that was unnerving. And there, near the foundation of the old well, a cluster of symbols I'd never seen before, tiny, almost imperceptible, like a rash of ancient script blossoming overnight. They were not drawn with the elegant hand of the original cartographer, but seemed etched, almost grown, from the very fibers of the parchment. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat, trying to recall if they had been there before. I was certain they had not. My meticulous memory, my cartographer's eye, would have registered such an anomaly. The rationalizations began to crumble then, like dry mortar. The map, my anchor, my precise, logical pursuit, was betraying me. It was changing, shifting, revealing secrets not through my effort, but as if by some unseen, internal will. And whatever was stirring beneath the ancient earth, it knew I was here. It was watching. It was waiting. A phantom chill traced my skin, yet I felt no actual cold. The silence, profound and absolute, pressed in, a weight that threatened to collapse my chest. There was no pain, no discomfort, only this vast, echoing emptiness, awaiting. My eyelids fluttered, then snapped open fully. Dust motes danced in the sliver of dawnlight that pierced the grimy windowpane, illuminating the warped plaster and peeling wallpaper. The rhythmic hiss was merely the ancient house groaning in its sleep, the mechanical breath the wind sighing through a broken pane somewhere downstairs. It had been a dream, a recurring phantom ache of a place I couldn't recall ever truly inhabiting. Yet, its stark clarity clung to me like grave soil, a residue of disquiet. I had come to this decaying estate seeking order, a cartographer's truth. Instead, I found only a deepening labyrinth of unanswered questions. They were growing bolder. Driven by a desperate, gnawing need for clarity, I rose. Sleep offered no refuge, only more unsettling visions. The estate, A sprawling monument to forgotten lives, held its secrets jealously, but I was determined to pry them loose. The library, a cavernous space choked with generations of neglect, became my battlefield. Dust, thick and pervasive, coated every surface, rising in clouds with each disturbance. The air, heavy and stale, tasted of parchment and time. I began with the oldest volumes, their leather bindings cracked and brittle, their pages foxed with age. My fingers, stained with ink and dust, traced faded script, sifting through ledgers, family histories, and obscure local almanacs. Hours blurred into a single, focused intensity. My eyes burned, but I pressed on, fueled by a growing certainty that the answers lay buried beneath layers of forgotten lives. Then, tucked away in a locked cedar chest in a forgotten corner, beneath a pile of moth-eaten linens, I found them, a collection of journals, their covers plain and unadorned, their pages filled with a delicate, spidery hand. The first entry was dated nearly 2 centuries ago. The language was archaic, the observations poetic, yet the underlying current of unease was unmistakable. The early entries spoke of bountiful harvests, of the land's generosity. But as the years turned, the tone shifted. The land's hunger grows, one entry read, the ink faded to sepia. It demands more than mere sustenance. A deep current runs beneath this soil, a vein of sorrow. Another, scrawled in a frantic hand, detailed the blight, a creeping madness that seemed to afflict certain members of the family, driving them to wander into the surrounding wilderness. Cryptic letters, brittle and fragile, spoke of disappearances, not just of family members, but of local laborers who ventured too close to specific areas of the estate. One letter, penned by a distant relative to a solicitor in the city, detailed strange occurrences near the old quarry, a location marked with a peculiar, unsettling symbol on my incomplete map. And it is not a breath of life. A pattern began to emerge, sharp and terrifying. Madness. Disappearances. Strange, inexplicable events. My fingers trembled as I laid the journals and letters beside my map. The incomplete lines, the strange, almost organic shapes, weren't just charting topography, they were charting a history of suffering, a blueprint for something ancient and hungry. The map wasn't just a guide to the estate, it was a key. A key to something buried, something that had festered beneath the earth for generations, slowly, patiently, demanding its due. The chill that now permeated the estate was no longer merely the bite of an old house. It was a living thing, a breath held close, exhaled in icy tendrils that coiled around my ankles, then my spine. I stood before the vast, pitted fireplace in the main hall, the map spread on the oak table before me, its parchment curling slightly at the edges as if recoiling from an unseen presence. My fingers traced the intricate lines, the unsettling voids, the strange, looping symbols that seemed to writhe beneath my gaze. A low groan rumbled from somewhere deep within the walls, not the settling of old timber, but something more deliberate, like a creature stirring from a long slumber. Then, a sharp crack echoed from the study, followed by the distinct sound of glass shattering. My breath hitched. I knew I had left the window latched, the heavy velvet drapes drawn tight. I moved, not with the hesitant steps of fear, but with a strange, almost defiant urgency. Each floorboard beneath my boots seemed to protest, groaning under a weight that felt heavier than my own. When I reached the study, the scene was not what I expected. No broken pane, no scattered shards. Instead, the antique oil lamp, which had rested securely on the writing desk, lay on the floor, its glass chimney shattered, the wick oil staining the Persian rug. It had not fallen, it had been thrown. The question was foolish. I knew, with a certainty that curdled my blood, that there was no who. Only what? They were no longer the indistinct murmurings, the phantom rustle of leaves I had dismissed as wind or fatigue. Come. Closer. Reid. The sound was a symphony of dry leaves skittering across stone, of brittle bones grinding, of something ancient and parched trying to speak. My own name, pronounced by such a thing, was a desecration. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass letter opener on the desk, a ridiculous gesture against an unseen threat. A sudden, violent tremor shook the house. Not an earthquake, but a focused, deliberate jolt that rattled every window pane, every loose fixture. A framed portrait of a grim-faced ancestor, perched precariously on a high shelf, flew across the room, smashing against the far wall with a deafening crash. Splinters of wood and canvas rained down. The blood. The lineage. Complete. The offering. My mind reeled. The offering. What offering, and for whom? My determination, once a steady flame, flickered under the onslaught. I needed help. I needed someone to witness this, to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with a sudden, uncontrollable tremor. I tried calling a colleague, an expert in historical cartography who had always humored my more esoteric theories. The phone rang once, twice, then a crackle of static, followed by a voice, not my colleague's, but a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the receiver itself. No escape. Reid. The line went dead. The signal bars on my phone, once strong, now showed a single, struggling sliver. Desperation clawed at my throat. I needed to get out, if only for a moment of respite, a breath of air untouched by this escalating horror. As I twisted, a sudden, blinding flash of white light consumed my vision. When my sight cleared, I wasn't in my dimly lit hallway anymore. I was standing in a long, narrow corridor, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of fluorescent lights. The walls were a sterile, institutional green, and the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something faintly metallic. A profound, terrifying emptiness permeated the space. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see a figure, a face, anything. But there was nothing. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the vision dissolved. I was back in my hall, my hand still on the doorknob, my chest heaving. The wood felt rough, familiar, yet utterly alien. My skin was clammy, my clothes clinging to me. The entity was not just confined to the estate, it was reaching into my mind, twisting my perceptions, sowing seeds of madness. A life for the land. Your blood. The key. The sacrifice. The estate was no longer just a place I inhabited, it was a hungry maw, and I, Reid, was its intended meal. The map, still on the table, seemed to glow with a triumphant, malevolent light. The demands echoed, not just in the creaking timbers and the whisper of dead air, but within the very marrow of my bones, a resonant thrum that vibrated against my skull. I had stumbled, yes, but the terror, a bitter bile rising in my throat, had not paralyzed me entirely. Instead, it had sharpened a desperate edge to my intellect, a frantic need to know. The estate, a hungry maw, demanded understanding, and I, Reid, its intended meal, felt an irresistible pull back to the map table. Dust motes, like tiny, lost souls, danced in the anemic light filtering through the grimy panes, illuminating nothing but the profound neglect that had settled like a shroud. Every groan of the old house was a breath, every sigh of the wind through broken eaves a murmur, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me, pressing down. My hands, trembling still, reached for the map, its parchment now seeming less like a historical document and more like a living skin, stretched taut over something unspeakable. The ink, once a benign record of boundaries and forgotten paths, now writhed with a sinister energy under my gaze. But the recent horrors, the gnawing certainty of a malevolent presence, had stripped away such academic complacency. I remembered a marginalia, almost invisible, within an old leather-bound journal I'd found tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the library. It was a fragment of script, written in a hand that mirrored my own family's, yet twisted, more frantic, almost a scrawl. I retrieved it now, the brittle pages crumbling slightly at my touch, releasing a puff of dust that tasted of graves and forgotten fear. I compared the symbols. The loops were not decorative. They were sigils. The lines were not paths. They were barriers. The very geography of the estate, rendered so meticulously, was not a record of what was there, but a diagram of what was contained. The map was not a guide to a hidden treasure. It was a blueprint for a prison. My fingers, numb with a dawning horror, moved across the parchment, following the intricate network of lines, the interlocking patterns that defined the estate's boundaries. They were not merely property markers, they were wards, woven into the very earth, etched into the stone foundations, binding something vast and unimaginably ancient. The hidden features I had sought, the anomalies that defied logical explanation, a subterranean vault not marked on any modern survey, a peculiar alignment of standing stones far beyond the property's recorded edge, these were not architectural quirks. They were points of anchor, foci for a containment that had held for centuries, perhaps millennia. And now, it was weakening. The incomplete sections of the map, the areas where the ink faded or was smudged, were not simply unfinished work. They depicted breaches, fissures in the containment. The entity, this nameless, formless thing that had haunted my waking hours and invaded my dreams, was not merely under the land, it was part of it, held captive, and it was stirring. The journal's frantic script spoke of the lineage, of the keepers, of the blood's duty. My ancestors. They hadn't just built this estate, they had been its jailers. Or perhaps, its wardens. The map, passed down through generations, was not an heirloom to be cherished, but a burden to be maintained. My blood, the same blood that had flowed through the keepers, was intrinsically linked to this ancient prison. I was not merely an unwitting heir. I was a crucial piece in a cosmic mechanism, a terrible, living key. Or was my very presence, the culmination of the lineage, the final, unwitting component needed to unmake the prison, to unleash the primal hunger upon a world utterly unprepared? The thought coiled in my stomach, a serpent of ice. As the understanding solidified, the room itself seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, pressing down on my chest until each breath became a labor. The faint metallic scent intensified, now mingling with something acrid, like ozone and burning leaves. From somewhere deep within the walls, a low, guttural thrum began, a sound that resonated not in the air, but directly against my teeth, making my jaw ache. It was the sound of something vast, slowly, terribly, waking. The distinction between containing and releasing, between salvation and damnation, had vanished. I was trapped, caught in a web spun across epochs, and the ancient thing beneath my feet was finally, after so long, ready to feed. And then it had struck. I woke, or half-woke, to the sterile scent of antiseptic and the quiet, rhythmic sigh of machines. My eyes fluttered open, refusing to focus. Above me, a ceiling tile, stained with an old watermark, swam into view. I was not in my study. I was not even in my ancestral home. A strange, disorienting shift had occurred. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my temples, and my limbs felt heavy, weighted with lead. I was lying on a gurney, or something similar, my body draped in a thin, rough sheet. The air was cool, almost too cool, raising gooseflesh on my arms. I pushed myself up, my muscles protesting with a profound weakness I hadn't felt before. I swayed, catching myself against the metallic rail of the gurney. The long corridor stretched before me, illuminated by infrequent, flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed with a low, melancholic hum. Doors, all identical, lined both sides, their surfaces smooth and unmarred. From behind some of them, I could hear the faint, steady beep-beep-beep of unseen monitors, the soft, mechanical exhalation and inhalation of ventilators. No voices, no hurried footsteps, no clatter of carts. Only the quiet, relentless breathing of the machines, a pulse for an empty world. A profound sense of abandonment washed over me. How had I arrived here? Was this a dream? A hallucination born of the entity's assault? And then, the fall. It was inside me, a serpentine coil of thought unspooling directly into my consciousness, devoid of sound but rich with meaning. I stumbled forward, needing to escape, needing to understand. The machines continued their ceaseless breathing, and with each rhythmic sigh, the voice seemed to grow stronger, clearer, more insidious. Give yourself to the earth. Let the roots claim you. You belong to the soil, to the lineage. It has waited. This was not just a voice, it was an attempt to unravel me from within, to possess the very core of my being. I could feel its tendrils seeking purchase in the soft gray matter of my brain, in the beating muscle of my heart. It wanted me to surrender, to walk back to the estate, to a specific, unholy spot on the map, and offer myself. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to push the invasive thoughts away, to ground myself. And then, a flicker. A sketch, crude but precise, of the estate's layout, but with an additional layer, arcane symbols, lines of force, and at its center, a stark, simple diagram of a circle within a square, bisected by a jagged line. And beneath it, a single, looping phrase written in a hand I now recognized as desperately urgent: to reseal the rift, the blood must be given back to the roots, not by shedding, but by severing. Severing the claim. It wasn't about physical blood or death, not in the way the entity wanted. It was about lineage, about my connection to this land, this cursed inheritance. The entity fed on the deep-rooted claim, the ancestral ties that bound me to the estate. To reseal it, I had to break that bond, to consciously and utterly renounce my claim to the land, to my birthright, to the very history that had defined me. This was the countermeasure, the desperate ritual. It demanded an act of immense will, a profound personal sacrifice. It meant severing myself from the very thing I, as a cartographer of history, cherished most, my connection to the past, to the earth, to my family's legacy. It meant becoming rootless, an anchorless vessel. If I failed, if I succumbed to the entity's insidious lure, it would not merely claim me. It would claim the land itself, and through the land, it would spread. The entity sought not just to exist, but to consume, to expand its domain of quiet horror beyond the boundaries of the estate, perhaps even beyond the veil of this world. Come, Reid. The soil calls. Surrender. The voice pressed, a suffocating weight. But the image of the journal, the desperate plea of my ancestor, burned brighter than the dim lights of the hallway. Sever. Renounce. The fight, I now understood, was not just for my life, but for the very essence of what it meant to be rooted, or to be free. The revelation, cold and stark, had not broken me. Instead, it had sharpened something within me, honing my purpose to a single, desperate point. Severing the claim. It wasn't about blood spilled on the ancient stones, not in the way the entity hungered. It was about severing the root, cutting the cord of inheritance that bound my lineage to this cursed land, to it. My resolve, brittle as old parchment, hardened into something like iron. I would descend. I would perform the ritual. The estate, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight, seemed to sigh with a malevolent breath as I stepped out. The air, thick and cloying, pressed against my skin, smelling of damp earth, stagnant water, and something else, something metallic and ancient, like old blood forgotten in the soil. My lantern beam, a trembling beacon, cut a meager path through the encroaching gloom. The old house, a sentinel of secrets, watched my departure from its gaping windows, each pane a vacant eye reflecting the deepening shadows. I did not hesitate. Below the crumbling flagstones of the oldest crypt, a narrow, earthen passage yawned. It was not a natural cave, but a deliberate excavation, shored up. With rough-hewn timbers that looked centuries old, groaning under the immense weight of the earth above. They clawed at the edges of my sanity, promising oblivion, promising relief, promising the endless peace of surrender. I pressed on, my boots crunching on loose shale, each step a defiance. The passage twisted, narrowing further until I had to squeeze my shoulders through, my breath rasping in the suffocating black. The timbers around me began to weep a viscous, black liquid that shimmered faintly in my light, smelling of decay and something acrid, like burnt sugar. I recoiled, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Suddenly, the rough-hewn walls dissolved. The smell of earth and decay vanished, replaced by the sterile, metallic tang of disinfectant and something subtly medicinal. I blinked, disoriented, my lantern beam now a jarring anachronism in this new, impossible space. My mind screamed at the impossibility, yet my senses insisted on its reality. Was this the entity's ultimate torment? To trap me in a place of vulnerability and despair, far from the purpose that drove me? A low hum began to vibrate through the floor, growing steadily, an insistent thrum that resonated in my bones. The rhythmic thump hiss distorted, becoming a wet, guttural gasp, then a chorus of strained, desperate breaths. The entity was pulling me back, asserting its dominion over my perception. With a gasp, the illusion shattered. The black liquid still wept from the timbers. My head throbbed, a relentless ache behind my eyes, but the jolt of the illusion had, perversely, strengthened my resolve. This was its game, its desperate attempt to make me falter. I would not. I pushed forward, the passage finally widening into a vast, vaulted chamber. The walls were not carved stone, but solidified earth, veined with strange, iridescent minerals that pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence. And everywhere, etched into the living rock, were symbols. Not mere carvings, but deep, visceral gouges, forming a sprawling, intricate mural. This was the reveal. My cartographer's eye immediately recognized patterns, connections. The mural depicted a grotesque family tree, its roots plunging deep into the earth, its branches twisting into monstrous forms. But the most terrifying discovery was not the depiction of the entity's parasitic hold, but a series of smaller, more explicit carvings beside my own image. They showed a ritual, a precise sequence of acts, not of sacrifice in the conventional sense, but of severance. A specific gesture, a symbol to be invoked, a specific point on the map, now revealed as the very heart of this chamber, where the ritual must be performed. It was not about death, but about unmaking a connection, about tearing the entity's tendril from my soul, and from the future of my bloodline. The price, however, was still terrifyingly clear: complete isolation. To sever the claim meant to sever myself from all that had come before, and all that might come after. This was it. This was the place, and this was the way. The air in the chamber pulsed with a palpable malevolence, a desperate, furious energy as the entity realized its ancient secrets were laid bare. But I had found the path. I had found the method. And I would not turn back. The world, as I knew it, fractured. One moment, the damp, earthen breath of the estate's hidden crypt filled my lungs, the next, a sterile chill, thin and metallic, scraped against my throat. The air, though still, tasted of antiseptic and something else, something cloying and ancient, like dust stirred from forgotten tombs. This was its final gambit, then. A prison of the mind, woven from my own fears of dissolution, of being reduced to a mere collection of failing systems. The entity, a tendril of pure malice, sought to unravel me here, in this liminal space, to claim the last vestiges of my conscious self. The rhythmic wheeze and sigh of unseen apparatus echoed the slow, deliberate pulse of something immense, something patient and hungry, waiting just beyond the threshold of my perception. It was about severing the root, cutting the connection. And I knew, with a clarity that pierced the fog of fear, that the connection wasn't merely to the land, but to me. My lineage. My mind. This was a map, too, albeit a twisted one. A cartography of control, designed to disorient, to overwhelm. But I was a cartographer. I understood lines, boundaries, the power of delineation. A low thrum vibrated through the soles of my feet, rising, then falling, like a monstrous heart struggling to beat. The estate's ley lines, the hidden springs, the subterranean passages, all were etched into my memory. More importantly, the points of containment. The ritual, as I had finally understood it, was not a physical act with arcane tools, but a mental one, a reassertion of order over chaos. You are weak. You are broken. The machines breathing nearby seemed to quicken, their exhalations growing ragged, panicked. I opened my eyes. The hallway now writhed. The walls seemed to bulge and recede, the floor undulated, and the doors pulsed with an inner, sickly light. This was the entity's true form, its boundless, formless hunger made manifest in the distortion of my perceived reality. It was trying to erase the boundaries, to merge with me, to claim me fully. But I had the map. Not on paper, but within the deepest chambers of my mind. I saw the estate not as a collection of buildings and land, but as a complex diagram of energies, of flows and blockages. And the entity, for all its ancient power, was anchored. It had a root. A point of origin that, once severed, would leave it adrift, powerless. I raised my hands, not to ward off, but to draw. In the air, with the sheer force of my will, I began to trace the lines of the true map. Imaginary sigils bloomed at my fingertips, glowing with an inner light that defied the sickly fluorescence. I felt a profound drain, a siphoning of my very essence with each stroke, but I pushed through it. This was the ritual. This was the severing. The entity roared, not with sound, but with a surge of pure, agonizing psychic pressure that threatened to collapse my skull. Visions flashed before my eyes, generations of my ancestors, their faces twisted in agony, their minds consumed. It showed me my own future, a blank, drooling existence, a puppet animated by its will. "You are contained," I choked out, pushing the words through a throat that felt lined with razor wire. I focused on the central point, the heart of the entity's claim on my lineage, the nexus where its ancient hunger had first taken root in the land and in the blood. My cartographic precision, usually applied to parchment and ink, now became a weapon of the spirit. I drew a final, binding line, a mental barrier of such absolute finality that it felt like tearing a piece of my own soul. A great, rending cry ripped through the hallway, a sound that was both everywhere and nowhere, a symphony of ancient agony and furious retreat. The distortions in the hallway flickered, then snapped back into stark, sterile reality. The entity was gone. Banished. Severed. I stood there, trembling, my legs weak, my vision blurring at the edges. But the cost. Oh, the cost. It was not a limb, not a life, but something far more insidious. A part of me, the part that had grappled with the entity, that had understood its ancient malice, felt missing. Torn away. The world no longer seemed quite so real, the lines of reality not quite so firm. I had one, yes. But I was no longer whole. I was a map with a crucial section erased, a territory forever lost to the cartographer. The air tasted of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and thin, like old pennies dissolved in a forgotten rain puddle. My eyelids felt heavy, glued shut by a fatigue that burrowed deeper than bone. When they finally fluttered open, the world was a blur of muted light and indistinct shapes. The rhythmic hiss and sigh of unseen devices provided the only counterpoint to the profound silence that had settled around me, a silence more absolute than any I had ever known. My body was an assemblage of aches, a patchwork quilt of pain. Every muscle screamed, every joint protested. Bandages swaddled my left arm from wrist to elbow, a pristine white against the angry crimson that had, I knew, once soaked the fabric. A dull throb pulsed behind my eyes, a relentless drummer marking the slow passage of time. My throat was parched, rough as old parchment. The entity. The word tasted like ash on my tongue, though I hadn't spoken it aloud. It was gone. I felt its absence like a phantom limb, a gaping void where a monstrous presence had once clawed at the edges of my perception. Yet, the relief was not pure. It was tainted, a bitter draught mingled with a new kind of emptiness, a desolation that seeped into my very core. My gaze drifted down my body, cataloging the damage. My right hand, unbandaged, bore a network of fine scars, crimson lines weaving across my knuckles and palm, a grim topography of my struggle. They felt strangely sensitive, almost alive, as if the nerves beneath had been rewired, attuned to some frequency I couldn't yet comprehend. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through my fingers. My ribs ached with every shallow breath, a dull, persistent protest against the violence they had endured. The cost. Oh, the cost. The estate, my ancestral home, lay in ruins, a desecrated monument to a forgotten horror. I could see it in my mind's eye, the shattered windows, the splintered timbers, the earth itself ripped open, revealing the festering wounds beneath. The subterranean passages, once the subject of my meticulous cartography, now served as a testament to the raw, destructive power unleashed. My maps, my life's work, were likely scattered, torn, meaningless in the face of such devastation. And what of the hidden features, the ancient secrets I had so eagerly sought? They were no longer secrets, they were scars, etched into the very fabric of the land, and into me. The ritual. The final, desperate act. It had worked. Or rather, I had survived it. But survival, I was learning, was not always a victory. Sometimes, it was merely a prolonged suffering, a sentence passed in the aftermath. I closed my eyes again, the sterile imagery of the hallway replaced by the intricate, hand-drawn lines of my ancestral chart. More importantly, the points of containment. The ritual, as I had final. A fragment of its knowledge, perhaps, or merely the indelible mark of its touch, like a brand seared onto my soul. The world outside this quiet hallway remained blissfully unaware. The sun would rise and set, seasons would turn, and the daily rhythms of mundane existence would continue, undisturbed by the cataclysm that had devoured my world. I was a ghost, a survivor of a war no one else knew had been fought. This isolation, this profound separation from the shared reality, was almost as heavy as the physical pain. It was a burden I would carry alone, a secret buried deeper than any ancient vault. My breath hitched. The machines in the hallway continued their quiet breathing, a steady, indifferent rhythm. I was alive. But what kind of life awaited me? The meticulous cartographer, the seeker of forgotten truths, was gone. My fingers, still trembling, traced the phantom lines of the map on the air before me, the lines that now seemed to glow with a faint, internal luminescence, visible only to me. The map was complete now, in a way I had never intended. And I, Reid, was its final, most terrible inscription. The rhythmic hiss and click of unseen apparatuses provided a sterile counterpoint to the thrumming in my own temples. My head ached, a deep, persistent throb that seemed to echo the silence of the corridor. Memories flickered, fragmented and sharp-edged, like broken glass. The chill of the earth, the scent of damp soil and ancient stone, the terrible, resonant hum that had vibrated not just through the ground, but through the very marrow of my bones. And then, the map. Always the map. What had I done? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered by the indifferent hum of the machines. It had demanded. And I, Reid, had given. The exact nature of the offering remained shrouded in a fog of exhaustion and trauma, a merciful blur that my mind refused to fully render. But the price. The price was etched into my soul with an indelible acid. Slowly, over days that bled into one another in the muted light, my strength returned. A quiet attendant brought trays of bland food, their steps soft on the linoleum, their faces perpetually neutral. No questions were asked of me, no explanations offered. It was as if I had simply existed, a temporary occupant in a space designed for silent recovery. I was allowed to simply be asterisk, to mend, or perhaps, to forget. But forgetting was not an option. The earth had spoken, and I had heard. When I was finally deemed ready to leave, the world outside felt too bright, too loud, too utterly indifferent. The sky was a vast, indifferent blue, and the familiar scent of rain on asphalt was a shock after the antiseptic tang that had filled my lungs. My estate, when I finally navigated the winding country roads back to its gates, loomed under a sky heavy with impending storm. A tomb. I walked the grounds, my steps tentative, my eyes scanning the familiar landscape with a new, unsettling clarity. The old oak, its branches gnarled like arthritic fingers, seemed to lean closer, its ancient roots delving deep into the very heart of the secret I now carried. The overgrown garden, the crumbling stone walls of the outbuildings, all were imbued with a fresh, terrible significance. I had not merely completed a map, I had completed a connection, a circuit, between the living and the ravenous. The excavation site, I found, had been filled in. I knew what slumbered beneath. My cartography tools lay untouched in the study, covered in a fine film of dust. The incomplete map, the very object of my obsession, was still spread across the large drafting table, its parchment yellowed, its lines still hinting at the terrible truth. But I could not bring myself to touch it. My life, the semblance of normal life I attempted to resume, was a carefully constructed facade. I would walk into town, exchange pleasantries with the shopkeepers, accept a newspaper, and return to the quiet solitude of my estate. But the world had shifted on its axis. I catalogued the subtle changes in the estate, the way the light fell differently on the western wall, the exact angle of a fallen branch after a storm. Not out of a desire for order, but out of a desperate need to monitor, to understand, to ensure the fragile peace I had bought was maintained. The price I paid was my tranquility. I was not a prisoner, yet I was bound. Bound to the land, bound to the secret, bound to the silent, terrible entity that I had disturbed and, in some unspoken way, appeased. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and the moon hung like a sliver of bone in the dark sky, I would feel it. A subtle pull, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that resonated in the very foundations of the estate, and deep within my own chest. It was not a command, not a threat, but an undeniable presence. I had contained the horror, yes. The immediate danger had passed. I was no longer just Reid, the cartographer. I was the guardian. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I wondered if I was truly guarding the secret, or if the secret was, in its own insidious way, guarding me. Or perhaps, compelling me. The line between was as thin and brittle as old parchment.